They poured whiskey on his boots and called him a coward in front of the whole saloon. He did not move. He did not speak. He finished his drink, then 8 of them were dead, and the floor was wet with something that was not whiskey. The man who poured it stood over him, laughing. The other 7 watched from the bar and from tables and from the doorway where the evening light was dying. They had been sent for exactly this. 8 hired men and a rancher who had decided that one stranger in Dodge City was an inconvenience worth solving. The whiskey ran off the toe of his boot and pooled on the floorboards. Someone at the far end of the bar picked up his glass and moved to leave. The stranger set his own glass down on the bar. He looked up at the man standing over him. That was all. He looked up. The room went quiet. If you have never been in a saloon when the air changes, you would not understand. But men who lived in that country understood. The air does not change for nothing. Something in the geometry of the room shifts. The laughter dies because the men who were laughing feel the new shape of the room before they understand it. This was a skill that had kept most of them alive long enough to reach this particular evening. They had learned to read rooms the way other men read weather. The stranger in the chair had read this room 3 days ago. He had known then what kind of night this would be. He had come anyway. The man who had poured the whiskey was named Harlan. He had worked for the Bar K for 11 years and had killed 4 men in that time, all of them in circumstances where the law had found no reason to object. He was not fast in the way the stories said fast. He was accurate in the way that only comes from killing enough men to stop counting. He had been chosen for this because the rancher trusted him, and because the rancher believed that 11 years of loyalty to a brand was worth more than any amount of natural talent. The rancher was not a stupid man, but he had made one calculation that was wrong, and that was enough. He had looked at the stranger sitting alone at the end of the bar, and he had seen an opportunity. A man alone. A man who did not look like he had friends in town. A man who could be provoked. The plan was simple. It had been explained to all 8 of them in the rancher's office with the door closed and the curtains drawn. They would take turns. One would pour the whiskey. Another would call the insult. The rest would watch and wait. When the stranger drew, and he would draw because no man could absorb that kind of humiliation without drawing, they would kill him, and the town would say he started it. The law in Dodge City was not complicated. Dead men did not give testimony. 8 witnesses would say the stranger drew first. It was clean. It was professional. It was the kind of plan that works on paper and fails in the moment when a man looks at you across a room and you understand, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that he is not going to draw first. He is not going to draw at all. The stranger looked at Harlan. He looked at him the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. There was no anger in the look. Anger was for men who had something to protect. This man had nothing to protect. He had no name to defend, no reputation, no pride that could be wounded by whiskey on his boots or laughter from a man who outweighed him by 40 pounds and had 6 guns between the 2 of them watching from across the room. The stranger reached into his shirt pocket and set a coin on the bar, enough for the whiskey he had been given and the one he was about to order. The bartender took the coin without being asked. That was when the youngest of the 8, the one standing nearest the door, decided he had enough of this. His name was Cole. He was 23 years old, and this was his 3rd job and his first time being part of something like this. He did not understand why the stranger was just sitting there. He did not understand why no one else was moving. He thought about the money the rancher had promised, and he thought about the look on his mother's face when he told her he was heading to Kansas to find work, and he thought about the door and the way the evening light was still coming through, and he made his decision in the space of a breath. He did not say anything. He just moved. His hand went for the door, and his back turned at the same time. In that fraction of a second, the stranger was already standing. Nobody saw him draw. That was the part that the men who survived would try to explain for years afterward, and never quite manage. There was no draw. There was the man at the bar, and then there was the sound, and then there was the man at the bar, with smoke rising from the barrel of his gun, and Cole on the floor, with his hand still reaching for a door that was not going to open for him. The bullet had found him before he understood that he had made a mistake. The stranger had not needed to wait for the back to turn. He could have fired the moment Cole reached for the door, but he had waited. He had waited for the exact moment when Cole was most committed to leaving, when the motion was irreversible, when there was no possible way to pretend that what was about to happen was anything other than what it was. That was the part that Harlan understood later, standing over the bodies with his gun still in his hand, when the stranger walked back to the bar and sat down and ordered another drink. The stranger had not been protecting himself. He had been teaching a lesson that the youngest of them would never have a chance to apply. The 7 remaining did not freeze. They were professionals. Harlan had trained them and paid them and earned their loyalty through 11 years of standing beside them when things went wrong. They moved. But the stranger was not standing still. He was already moving along the bar, one hand on the wood, his body in a line that made no man his front sight and every man his target. The second man got his gun up. The stranger shot him from the hip without slowing. The third man fired from the hip as well and missed because the stranger had already shifted his weight, and the shot passed through the space where a man would have been standing half a second earlier. The stranger's second shot caught the third man in the chest, and the third man sat down on the floor with a sound like a heavy coat being dropped. 4 were on their feet now. The stranger dropped the man with the hip shot and turned to the 4. He fired twice. 2 men fell. The 2 who were left raised their guns at the same instant, and the stranger met their eyes across the room. He did not rush. He took 1 step to his left and shot the man on the right, and then the man on the left, and both of them were still holding their guns when they hit the floor. 7 men were down. The room smelled like gun smoke and whiskey and something else that did not have a name in any language the people in that room knew. Harlan was the last one standing. He had not moved since the stranger looked up at him. He was still standing over the empty chair with the empty glass in his hand, his gun drawn and his arm half raised, and he understood now what the stranger had understood from the beginning. There was no plan for this. There was no scenario in the rancher's office that had prepared any of them for a man who moved the way this man moved, who fired the way this man fired, who looked at 8 armed men the way a carpenter looks at 8 nails that need to be set into wood. The stranger walked to the end of the bar and sat down. He ordered another drink. He placed a coin on the bar. The bartender poured it. Nobody spoke. The stranger drank. When he was finished, he left 2 coins on the bar, stood up, and walked out into the night. He did not look at Harlan. He did not need to. Harlan would not follow. Harlan understood. The floor of the saloon had 7 men on it, and 1 more outside in the alley with a bullet in his shoulder where he had fallen after crawling out through the back door. Cole was dead. The man with the hip shot was dead. The man who had fired and missed was dead. The 3 men who had been standing were dead. 2 more lay in the space between the tables and the bar, breathing shallow and fading. Harlan stood in the middle of it all, with his gun still drawn and his hands starting to shake. The bartender was behind his bar with his hands in the air. The piano player was not at the piano. The doors of the saloon still swung gently in the evening air. The man outside in the alley was named Booker. He had crawled 20 feet on his belly before the strength ran out of his arms and he had to stop. He lay in the dirt with his face turned toward the gap between the buildings and the stars coming out one by one over Dodge City, and he thought about his wife in Fort Worth and the house they were buying on installments and the way she had looked at him the morning he left. Not with suspicion, but with the kind of quiet understanding that comes from being married long enough to know what your husband is when he comes home and what he is when he does not. He had been a good man for most of his life. He had made one decision on this particular evening that would not allow him to be that man again. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder and lodged somewhere inside him, and he knew enough about these things to know that it would not kill him, but it would change him. He would carry the metal in his body for whatever time he had left. He would feel it in the mornings when the weather changed. He would explain it to his wife when he got home, and she would not ask him the questions that mattered because she would already know the answers, and knowing them would not help anyone. He closed his eyes and waited for someone to come and find him, or for the night to pass, whichever came first. Inside the saloon, the regular patrons began to return. Not the 8 men. They were not going anywhere. But the people who had been there before the 8 arrived, the men and women who had been drinking and playing cards and arguing about the price of cattle, they came back slowly through the swinging doors and stood at the entrance and looked at what had happened to the room where they had been standing less than 10 minutes ago. They did not say anything. They did not ask the bartender what had happened because the bartender was not in a condition to answer questions. He was sitting on the floor behind the bar with his back against the wood and his eyes open and his hands still raised in the air as if he had forgotten to put them down. Someone from the back room came out and helped him up and poured him a drink, and the bartender drank it without looking away from the far end of the bar where the stranger had been sitting. The glass was still there. The 2 coins were still there. The stain on the floorboards where the whiskey had run off the stranger's boot was still there. The glass, the coins, and the stain. That was all the stranger had left behind. That and 7 bodies, and 1 man in the alley who was still breathing. The messenger reached the rancher's house within the hour. He did not come in. He stood on the porch and delivered the report through the window, and then he waited. The rancher sat in his office for a long time after the messenger left. He looked at the wall where his own gun hung. Then he took it down and set it on the desk. Then he set it back on the wall. He did not send more men. He closed the Bar K operation that spring and moved his cattle south, away from the Kansas trails, away from the towns where a man could walk into a saloon and walk out again with 7 fewer problems standing between him and the door. He did not tell anyone why. Some decisions do not need to be explained. Dodge City had seen violence before. It had been built on the back of it, shaped by it, made into something that functioned precisely because the people who lived there had learned to measure the distance between a problem and a solution with the cold precision of a gunfight. Men arrived in Dodge City every day with money in their pockets and violence in their history, and the simple expectation that they would leave one day, one way or another, and the town would go on functioning without them. But this was different. The men on the floor of that saloon had not lost. They had been undone. There was a difference. A man who loses a fight fights again. A man who has been undone by a stranger who did not hurry, who did not speak, who did not so much as raise his voice. That man understands something about the world that he did not understand before he walked into that saloon. The world is not the place he thought it was. The men he trusted to stand beside him are not coming back. The money in his pocket does not purchase safety. The plan he made did not account for the man who does not need a plan. Harlan left Dodge City before sunrise. He did not collect his wages from the rancher. He did not go back to the Bar K to pack his things. He walked to the livery stable and saddled a horse that was not his, and rode south until the town was gone behind him, and the trail stretched out ahead in the early morning light. He did not look back. He would never look back. Looking back was the habit of men who had learned something that night that they could not afford to remember. He had learned that there are men in the world who do not need 8 men to kill, who do not need a plan, who do not need anything except the space between one heartbeat and the next to do what they do. He did not want to know who those men were or where they came from or why they were the way they were. He wanted to forget that they existed. That was the only thing he wanted. The stranger rode out of Dodge City before dawn. Scout moved quietly under him, hooves finding the trail in the dark, the way water finds the lowest ground. He did not look back. He never looked back. Looking back was a habit for men who needed reassurance that the past was still there. He knew where he had been. He knew what he had done. He knew the weight of it in the way a man knows the weight of his own body, not as something he thinks about, but as something he carries. He did not need to see Dodge City recede in the distance. He knew what he had left behind. He always knew. The trail north was empty at that hour. The stars were still out, and the sky was just beginning to think about changing color from black to gray. The air was cool and smelled like dust and sage and the distant promise of rain that would not come for another 3 weeks. He rode with his hands loose on the reins and his eyes moving across the horizon the way they always moved, scanning, counting, measuring. This was not a skill he had learned. It was older than learning. It was the kind of awareness that gets burned into a man by years of needing it, by nights spent sleeping with one eye open and mornings that did not always arrive safely. The desert taught this awareness, or it killed the men who could not acquire it. He had been taught. He had survived. By the time the sun was fully up, he had covered 12 miles, and the town behind him was nothing but a smudge on the horizon that he did not turn to look at. He stopped at a creek to water Scout and drink from his canteen and check the loads in his guns. This was routine. This was the same thing he had done 1,000 times before, and would do 1,000 times again. The creek water was cold and tasted like stone. He knelt at the edge and let Scout drink and watched the light come across the flat country to the east, turning the grass from black to green to gold in the space of 100 yards. He did not hurry. He never hurried. Hurrying was for men who were afraid of where they were going. He knew exactly where he was going. He had always known. Somewhere ahead there was another town, another problem, another moment where someone would decide that silence meant weakness and stillness meant fear. They would be wrong. They had always been wrong. And the desert had a way of revealing men, and this man had a way of being present when that happened. The code was not written anywhere. It lived in the way men stood in the street when they did not know each other, in the distance they kept, in the way they measured the silence between strangers with eyes that had learned to count. You did not provoke a man who had nothing to prove. You did not pour whiskey on a man's boots and call him a coward unless you were prepared to understand what the word coward meant in a country where courage was not a choice, but a condition of survival. The saloon opened again 3 days later. The floor was scrubbed clean. 7 chairs had been replaced. The bar kept a space open at the far end, where a man could sit with his back to the wall. Nobody ever sat there. The bartender never explained why. Some things do not need explaining. Some things just remain, the way a scar remains after the wound is healed, visible to anyone who knows what to look for. A week later, a woman came in and asked for a drink and sat at that end of the bar and stayed for an hour without speaking. The bartender watched her and did not ask what she was waiting for. He understood. Some people come to a place to remember what happened there. Some people come to be near the shape of a moment that changed the direction of everything. She left before sunset and did not come back. Her name was not important. What she had been looking for was not important. What mattered was that she had come. That was enough. The saloon held its silence, and the silence held its shape. And the men who came in to drink at the end of the day did not ask questions about the empty chair, or the space at the bar, or the stain on the floor that would not quite come out no matter how many times the boards were scrubbed. They knew, they had heard, they understood. Subscribe. If this story found something in you, subscribe. There are more. The desert is vast, and the man who walks through it leaves stories behind him the way a river leaves stones. Each one takes time to understand. Each one is true in the way that matters. Comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you. The silence in the saloon before the first shot. Cole reaching for the door. Harlan standing over the empty chair with his gun in his hand. The rancher setting his gun back on the wall. The desert does not repeat itself, and neither does the man who moves through it.